From the first seconds, this morning was no different from hundreds of others. Barcelona greeted the new day as if the world was still asleep. The air was fresh, humid, and warm, typical of an early Mediterranean morning. A light milky mist still hung over the coast, which gradually dissolved under the first rays of the sun. In the distance, a steady hum could be heard, the sound that any major airport lives by, the energy of order, where every minute is scheduled, as if reality itself is subordinated to the flight schedule. Barcelona El Prat is a huge mechanic that never stops. This place has survived 2 world wars, dozens of changes of era and technology. Built more than a century ago, in 1916, the airport has long ceased to be just a point on the map. It became the gateway to Europe for millions of people, and in 2014 to 2015 it became one of the 10 largest airports on the continent. Everything here is subject to movement: teletraps, tractors, luggage platforms, a whole city of cars and people that works exactly to the second. The morning sun illuminated the apron, as if highlighting every detail. The smooth lines of the markings, the gleam of aluminum structures, the dark stripes of the warming brake discs of aircraft that had recently completed night flights. Mechanics were already inspecting the wings and landing gear, crews were receiving briefings, and there were quiet queues for check-in outside the terminal. There is a special contrast in such shots. The absolute order created in a world where people are used to chaos. Here, at the airport, everything should work perfectly, like clockwork. And in the midst of all this tranquility, as if lost in routine, there was an Airbus A320-211. The white fuselage with purple stripes of the GermanWings reflected the sun's glare, as it had millions of times before. For everyone around, it was one of dozens of departures in the coming hours. Flight 9525, Barcelona, Düsseldorf. A safe route, a short flight through France. There was nothing unusual about it. The engineers went through the checklist, carefully noting the condition of the wing cover, the front landing gear, angle of attack sensors, and engine air intakes. Their movements were confident, mechanically precise. Many years of experience transforms even complex procedures into a clear, almost choreographic process. Inside the terminal, a green line lit up above the flight. Boarding. Passengers were gathering at the exit. Someone was leafing through a newspaper. Someone was finishing their coffee. Someone was checking their boarding pass. The atmosphere was calm, almost sleepy. These shots could be part of an ordinary travel chronicle. Barcelona. Morning. People are flying on business, returning home, going on a business trip, or just trying to get to another city as soon as possible. And there was nothing to indicate that this particular flight would soon be at the center of the most resonant tragedy of European aviation of the 21st century. But at that moment, the world was living in complete peace. There was no one to know that the calm voices at the boarding desk, the steady hum of the air conditioners near the ceiling of the terminal, the crew checking the route. All these are the last minutes of absolute normality. And at the foot of the ramp, where passengers were just beginning to climb into the cabin, no one could have imagined that after a few hours the whole world would know the name of this flight. The airport's routine mechanisms continued to work as flawlessly as ever. The tractor driver aligned the trajectory on the platform, following the yellow lines. The flight attendants greeted the first passengers. With every passing second, the liner was getting closer to the moment when its wheels would lift off the ground. And yet, even though no one at the airport could sense it, there seemed to be a subtle contrast in the atmosphere, order hiding the approaching chaos. This is how the days that history will later call turning points often look like. They start perfectly normally, and only then do you realize that it was a morning when everything could still be changed. A morning that should have been ordinary. But on this day, no one knew that a regular flight would be the most tragic in the history of GermanWings. While the passengers took their seats and the stewards checked the luggage racks, the world around the Airbus A320 continued to live with the rhythm of precision. If you listened closely, you could sense a special harmony, a combination of human control and engineering logic. Aviation generally exists on this delicate balance, where people's emotions are limited by strict procedures, and any decision rests on numbers, norms, and algorithms. An airplane does not exist by itself. He is the product of a huge security system that starts long before a passenger buys a ticket. Each airliner has its own life cycle, and it is measured not by the age in the passport, but by the number of cycles, takeoffs, and landings. One cycle is the load on the fuselage, wings, landing gear, wiring, hydraulics. If you compare an airplane with a car, it becomes clear. The car ages with time, and the liner ages from repeated loads. Therefore, there are no old or young aircraft in aviation. There are serviced and unserviceable ones. The Airbus A320 that operated the GermanWings flight today was born in 1990, almost 25 years in the sky. But this is not old age, but a normal age for aviation. Such machines can fly for 30 or 40 years if they are properly cared for. That is why each liner undergoes several levels of maintenance. This is not a formality, but a real basis for security. The first level is A check. It is performed every 400 to 600 flight hours. This is not disassembly or repair, but an in-depth inspection. Engineers walk around the aircraft with almost surgical precision. They check the airframe, the so-called external structure from nose to tail, look at the skin for microcracks, assess the condition of the landing gear, brake discs, and hydraulic lines. They test the operation of electrical systems, check the aerodynamic surfaces, flaps, slats, elevator. In the cabin, emergency equipment is monitored. Oxygen masks, fire extinguishers, belts, first aid kits. If necessary, the filters are replaced, the hydraulic fluid is topped up, and the moving elements are lubricated. It all takes one night. The plane is put in the hangar in the evening, and in the morning it is ready for flight again. This is the rhythm in which modern civil aviation lives. The next level is D-check. It is held every 1.5 to 2 years. This is more serious. The aircraft is being decommissioned for several weeks. The panels on the fuselage are opened, reaching the hidden mechanisms, cable networks, and hydraulic systems are checked. Here, they do not look at signs of wear, but at forecasts, which elements may require replacement in the near future. Such an inspection is almost a medical diagnosis. Engineers record every anomaly, evaluate the remaining resources of the parts, and combine the data with logs from previous inspections. And finally, C-check is a large-scale procedure that can be compared to a major renovation. Every 6 to 10 years, the liner is literally disassembled. They remove the interior trim, free up access to the structure, and check the fuselage's power elements, the very long metal spars that hold the hull strength. The engines are dismantled and sent to separate stands. Each nut undergoes a certified inspection. Each node has a passport and a resource specified by the manufacturer. If the resource is running out, the part is replaced in advance. It is thanks to such cycles that cars that were built back in the 80s continue to fly around the world. They are not just serviceable, they meet modern requirements because aviation safety is constantly being updated. The A320 that was parked on the Barcelona platform passed all the mandatory checks. His technical journal did not contain any critical comments affecting security. The CFM56 engines worked smoothly, without vibrations. The electrical system provided a stable voltage. The hydraulics were fine. Warning and indication systems without failures. The autopilot and flight control channels are operational, confirmed by both checks and logs of previous flights. And this creates an important contrast. The deeper you look into aviation training, the more obvious it becomes. Technology is one of the most reliable things in the modern world. It operates according to strict regulations, it is checked by dozens of people, data is recorded in hundreds of logs and systems. Every screw, every sensor goes through the certification process, is controlled by international standards. This is how security is created. Not with words, but with actions repeated thousands of times. And today, the whole mechanism has worked flawlessly again. The plane was working properly. His systems were functioning normally. And everything that depended on the engineering part was done perfectly. So the problem wasn't with the car. While the mechanics were completing the last checks and the stewards were checking the readiness of the cabin, two people were looking through documents in a nearby office building before departure. The whole world would know their names later, but at that moment they were just another crew on a routine flight to Northern Europe. The aircraft commander is Patrick Sondheimer, 34 years old. One of those pilots they say is reliable, calm, technically competent. His career path at Lufthansa was almost exemplary. Years of training, rigorous exams, thousands of flight hours. More than 6,000 hours in the air, of which about 3,500 were on the Airbus A320. He knew this type like home. He felt the reaction of the aircraft to the levers, almost intuitively understood the dynamics of the engine and the behavior of the liner at different altitudes. Some pilots joke that an experienced commander's plane flies with an extension of his hands. It suited Sondheimer perfectly. He gave the impression of a man who knows how to keep order even in small things. He liked it when everything worked according to the rules. The documents were collected, the route was checked, the weather report was studied. In the cockpit, he created an atmosphere of calm, the kind in which passengers don't even know how many factors the crew takes into account before the plane takes off. Next to him is the co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, 27 years old. In aviation, this is the age when a pilot has already completed basic training, but is still gaining experience. His flight time was much more modest, 919 hours in total, and about 540 on the A320. He received access to the lines less than a year ago, in June 2014. From the point of view of standards, this is a normal situation. Young pilots enter schedules, gain practice, and learn from senior colleagues. Their professional paths were different, but that day they were a couple who should work as a single system. The commander sets the pace, the co-pilot performs part of the procedures, conducts radio exchange, and controls flight parameters. This is a tandem in which mutual trust is not a formality, but a basic element of security. On paper, everything looked perfect. An experienced captain and a young pilot who had been trained in a strict European school. In the briefing room, they calmly studied the flight plan. The route was straightforward: Barcelona, Perpignan, Marseille, Lyon, Dusseldorf. Echelon 380 is about 11,600 meters. The weather is clear along the way. No signs of turbulence or thunderstorms. Travel time is about an hour and 40 minutes. Dry numbers, routine, forecasts that don't raise any questions. Yet there was a subtle contrast in the air between the two people. It wasn't negative, but rather reflected a difference in character, experience, and internal structure. The captain moved confidently, as if mentally replaying every action several steps ahead. The co-pilot is more collected, a little tense, sometimes looking at documents longer than necessary. But to an observer, it looked natural. Age, concentration, the desire not to make mistakes. They exchanged short phrases about the weather and the time of landing. Sondheimer thoughtfully noted the possible congestion of the airspace near Marseille. Lubitz nodded, looking at the fuel balance chart. Their conversation was calm, working, the same as it happens hundreds of times between hundreds of other crews. When the briefing was over, they headed for the plane. The passage gallery let in the cold morning light, reflecting it off the glass panels. Pilots walk this path from the office space to the cockpit so many times that it ceases to be conscious. But when viewed from the outside, it has an almost symbolic framing. Two people enter a space where their destinies for the next 2 hours become interconnected. Sondheimer was the first to take the seat on the left, in the commander's chair. Lubitz is positioned on the right, checking the list of procedures he has to perform. The clicks of switches, the soft glow of displays, the first lines of data on the screens. The cabin came to life and became a single organism. The outside world gradually went out behind the closed door, leaving only the lights inside, the sound of electronics turning on, and two pilots preparing for a routine flight. Everything was calm, logical, predictable. None of them felt that this flight would be a turning point, that after a while, this particular cabin will be at the center of the biggest investigation of the decade. Both took their seats in the cockpit, unaware that their last flight had already begun. When the cabin was fully alive, the indicators went out in a steady working glow, and the route appeared on the navigation screens. The crew began to follow the pre-flight procedure. It's a ritual that pilots repeat hundreds of times, so precise that it almost feels like choreography. But every move makes sense. The systems on which hundreds of lives on board depend are being tested. The commander confirmed the fuel level, 6.3 tons. This was more than enough for the Barcelona-Dusseldorf route, even with a reserve for an alternative airfield in Frankfurt. The co-pilot checked the takeoff speed calculation. V1, the moment after which takeoff becomes irreversible. VR, the speed at which the commander pulls the steering wheel to take off. And V2, the safe rate of climb in case of engine failure. All three values appeared on the screen, synchronizing the onboard system data with the crew calculations. Outside, the flight attendant signaled cabin ready, which meant that all passengers had taken their seats, the luggage racks were closed, and the cabin was ready for departure. The luggage hatches were closed on the platform, and the tractor took up position in front of the forward stand. The crew requested permission from the dispatcher to start the engines and push out of the parking lot. After a short confirmation on the frequency, the commander switched on the CFM56 starboard engine start switch. The distinctive sound of the compressor spinning up was heard in the cabin. First a slight buzz, then an increasingly confident, low, even tone. On the ECAM screen, this is a centralized display and control system that shows the status of all systems. The temperature and speed arrows crept up. After a few seconds, the engine reached low throttle. Then the left one was launched, the one on the side of the ramp. It is usually launched second to avoid turbulent flows and noise in the passenger boarding area. When both engines stabilized, the tractor began to smoothly pull the plane back. Through the windows, passengers could see how the apron was slowly shifting, and the plane was carefully rolling out towards the taxiways. This movement always creates the feeling that a huge machine is finally coming to life. Now it is ready for its own rhythm. At the taxiway, the crew checked the response of the steering surfaces. The ailerons smoothly went up and down, the elevator responded symmetrically, the pedals caused the rudder to move. This is a standard but vital part of the procedure, making sure that the aircraft obeys commands. All indicators were normal. The dispatcher gave the order, steer to the preliminary start of the 07R lane. The plane moved along the terminal, then turned onto the main taxiway. In the cockpit, there is a calm conversation about the weather on the route and the airport load in Dusseldorf. There is a familiar movement in the cabin. Seat belts being fastened, phones turning off, hatches closing. At such moments, air travel seems like a predictable routine where there is no room for surprises. The plane stopped at the pre-launch line. The commander turned his gaze to the instruments, checked the modes again. The co-pilot contacted the dispatcher and requested permission. After a few seconds, the broadcast answered briefly and clearly. "GermanWings 18 Golf. Cleared for takeoff. Runway 07 right." The commander smoothly brought the engines to the takeoff power mode. A low rumble filled the cabin, which was quickly replaced by a confident, powerful roar. Vibrations passed through the floor. The plane was preparing to take off from the ground. The engines gained traction, and the A320 began to accelerate along the flat concrete strip, accelerating faster and faster. Speeds V1, VR. The commander pulled the steering wheel towards himself. The nose of the aircraft rose gently. The landing gear lifted off the runway, and the Airbus A320 began to climb. Terminal buildings, lanes, and parking lots were rapidly shrinking under the wing. Seconds later, the city was already a foggy strip left behind. When the airliner gained sufficient altitude, the crew retracted the landing gear, confirmed the climb mode, and turned on the autopilot. This is a normal procedure. The autopilot helps to keep the course, altitude, and speed more accurate than a human can do, especially on long sections of the route. The winged aircraft smoothly entered the airspace corridor, heading towards the Mediterranean coast, then towards France. The climb was flawless. No overloads, no jerks. The airspace was clean and the weather was perfectly stable. 27 minutes after takeoff, the plane reached flight level 380, the point where it was supposed to fly at cruising speed for more than an hour. The engines switched to economy mode, the vibrations decreased, and the liner seemed to enter a smooth, almost serene glide. There was that type of calmness in the cabin that is difficult to describe in words. This is a condition familiar to every pilot. When the car is working perfectly, the autopilot is on course, the indicators are stable, and there is a predictable, flat section of the route ahead. Sondheimer and Lubitz exchanged short phrases, discussed minor everyday topics, the usual conversation of the crew at cruising altitude. Nothing seemed to be able to break this routine. Everything was going according to schedule. The plane confidently maintained altitude. The controllers received and transmitted standard instructions to the board. No alarms, no deviations. But calmness has a strange nature. Sometimes the quietest period becomes a prologue to events that cannot be predicted. And at that moment, neither the passengers nor the airline staff nor the dispatchers. No one could have known that the flight rhythm was about to change. After 30 minutes, the silence in the cabin will be broken by the sound of the door opening. The cruise continued smoothly, almost meditatively. The height is stable. The speed is normal. The familiar green route line is displayed on the screens. At such moments, the cabin turns into a space of silence, where only the light clicks of switches and the background noise of ventilation can be heard. The autopilot kept every detail of the flight accurate to tenths of a degree. At about 10:30 a.m., the captain uttered a short phrase, without any peculiarities in his voice, without tension. The usual notification that he needs to leave his seat. This is a routine situation. Pilots do this every day on several thousand flights around the world. The autopilot controls the trajectory. The co-pilot remains in the seat, the door closes, and after a minute or two, everything returns to its usual rhythm. But this time was an exception. On the CVR recording, the flight voice recorder, you can hear the cabin door closing. A soft mechanical click, after which the airliner remains in flight under the control of one person. At this moment, there is nothing unusual in the cabin. The indicators are even, the speed is constant, the engine is in cruising mode. It was a moment of absolute normality. Then the first deviation occurs. In less than half a minute, the flight recorder, which records hundreds of parameters per second, from the position of the control knobs to the cabin air temperature, registers a change in the set altitude. The number on the flight control unit panel, the block panel at the top of the dashboard through which pilots set altitude, speed, and course, changes dramatically. From the usual 38,000 feet, the system gets a new value, 30 meters. This is almost the minimum height that can be entered manually. It actually means the ground level. Immediately after, the autopilot switches to the open DES mode, open descent. This is a function in which the aircraft begins to reduce altitude as freely as possible, without fixed steps. At the same time, the automatic traction system, A/THR, switches to thrust idle mode, minimum throttle. The engines slow down, the thrust decreases, and the liner begins a smooth but steady descent of about 1,000 meters per minute. The cabin is still quiet. Lack of radio exchange. Not a single call from the co-pilot. No attempts to adjust the modes. Only the steady noise of the airflow behind the glass and the quiet signals of the systems that record the change in parameters. Outside there is a clear sky, snowy peaks of the Alps. There is no reason for an emergency maneuver. There are no visual landmarks that could justify a sudden drop. The car is working properly. The weather is stable. The liner follows a straight line towards the mountain range. Controllers in the Marseille sector first notice the descent as an anomaly. Sometimes the crews change altitude by agreement, sometimes it is a technical adjustment. But there was no request here. The height drops from 11,600 meters to 11,000, then lower, and all this time the board is silent. Attempts to contact begin immediately. Short calls, repeated calls, clarifying the call sign. No response, no mention of the reason, no explanation of what is happening. Pilots of other planes nearby are included in the broadcast. Traditionally, if the crew does not respond to the dispatcher, colleagues sometimes try to get in touch directly. But here, too, the result is the same. Complete silence. Usually, any unexpected maneuver is accompanied by a dialogue. It indicates the reason, requests permission to descend, and confirms the changes. There's nothing here, just the numbers on the radar screens that keep falling. The aircraft is still operational in the cockpit. The sensors are working. The radio stations are on. The autopilot executes the assigned commands. No signs of machinery failure or loss of control. Just silence, a closed door, and one person who doesn't say a word. The altitude continues to decrease. 10,000 meters, 9,000, 8. The dispatchers are trying to call the airliner more and more persistently, but the air remains empty, as if the plane is flying in a vacuum. These are the first minutes when a system built on precision and predictability encounters behavior that defies logic and all participants. The crews of other flights, dispatchers, and automated systems continue to act according to procedures, not realizing that no one else is responding to them. Dispatchers notice an illogical decrease. And silence. Absolute silence. The descent continued steadily, as if someone had just pressed the altitude switch without jerks, without panic, without signs of a struggle with control. On the dispatcher screens, the trajectory of the GermanWings 9525 looked like a smooth diagonal going down. But in reality, this diagonal was the exact opposite of calm. Another call went on the air. GermanWings 18 Golf, Marseille Control. Do you read? There was no response. The dispatcher repeated it. Then again. Then I tried to change the frequency to eliminate the possibility of incorrect receiver settings. There was no result. While the car was passing through the 8,000 meter mark, the controller called the neighboring crews. This is standard practice. Sometimes the aircraft may accidentally adjust the wrong frequency or temporarily lose communication. In such cases, other pilots try to make direct contact using a common frequency. The first to respond was the crew flying west. a liner bound for Lisbon. "GermanWings, this is a Lufthansa flight. Can you hear us?" Pause. Silence. Try again. The other crew tried in French, then in Spanish. The radio remained blank. In flight, even a few seconds of silence can be alarming when the situation is unusual. Minutes passed here. Quiet, long, oppressive. The altitude was dropping, and the plane was not doing anything that would indicate an attempt to stabilize the flight. No engine mode changes, no course corrections, no descent requests. Only a smooth, confident line on the displays, as if the decrease had been pre-programmed. The dispatcher introduced the emergency phase procedure. He signaled to the services that the flight was behaving abnormally. The communication terminals have enabled advanced monitoring. But at that moment, all the staff on the ground could do was monitor the radar parameters. There were no other communication channels. The plane was silent. The decrease became noticeable for all the surrounding sides. One of the pilots would later say, "It looked like the airliner was just sliding down without responding to anyone. We only see this on simulators, and even then in training situations." The air was clear over the Alps, and the weather was stable. This made what was happening even more inexplicable. With reduced visibility, thunderstorms, or turbulence, the decrease could be explained. But here the sky was perfect, and the blinking of the markings on the radar became the only dialogue between the dispatchers and the car. The commander was trying to get back into the cockpit at that moment. The CVR will later record the knocks, rhythmic, intensifying. Then he can be heard calling the crew through the internal communication system. An access request signal is heard on the recording, a special melody that means that someone is at the door waiting for admission. But the door remains closed. The plane continued to descend. 7,000 meters, 6.5. The trajectory was perfectly stable, as if it was guided by an automatic mode that did not react to anything external. This made the situation even more paradoxical. The plane behaved technically correctly, almost exemplary, but not a single action of the crew was confirmed on the air. The controllers tried to warn about the decrease in the airspace ahead. The airliner has already entered the mountainous terrain zone, where the minimum safe heights are much higher than in the lowland regions. The contours of the mountains appear in red on the controller's maps, an automatic warning that the aircraft is on a trajectory incompatible with the terrain. Communication attempts continued. "GermanWings, please respond. Confirm your altitude. Do you require assistance?" The answer is the same emptiness of the ether. At about 4,000 meters, it became clear that the plane was not attempting to stabilize altitude. Autopilot parameters are normal. The engines are working. The speed is controlled. The crew is not responding. This contrast was the most disturbing for the professionals. In aviation, it is rare to find a situation where the parameters are perfect, but people are silent. On the radar, the airliner was moving towards the southern slope of the Astrop, to the area where the mountains rise by 1,500 meters. The dispatchers had minutes left, but even in those minutes, they did not receive a single word. No signal, no comment, and at that moment, even from the ground, it was clear. The machine obeyed only those commands that had been entered before. No intervention, no correction, nothing. But there was only one pair of hands in the cockpit, and one person who made the decision. From that moment on, time seems to slow down. In a normal flight, seconds pass unnoticed, disappearing into the routine operation of the instruments. But here, every second becomes a separate frame, one step of a huge machine steadily and steadily going down. The height is about 4,000 meters. The plane is already crossing the border of a dense mountain range. Snow relief is visible. The white ridges of the Alps, calm and motionless. as if they were indifferent witnesses of what was happening. Against their background, the Airbus appears to be a lonely silhouette moving to where the air is getting colder and space is narrower. There is silence in the cabin. On the CVR recording, only system background noises are heard: ventilation, faint crackling of the radio, light clicks that occur when the panels vibrate. Not a single word, not a single breath except for one smooth, calm, mechanically stable. The door to the cabin remains closed from the outside. On the recording, the commander can be heard trying to enter again. At first, there were confident but restrained blows. Then the reinforced ones. This is not a panic. This is an attempt by a person who acts strictly according to the procedure, but understands that the procedure does not work. There is an armored panel behind the door, designed so that it cannot be opened by force. These blows further emphasize the contrast. Everything inside the aircraft is working properly. The autopilot continues to perform descent mode, and the door, once created as a protection, now becomes an insurmountable boundary. 10 hours, 39 minutes, and 45 seconds. The GPWS system, a warning about the proximity of the Earth, is still silent. The plane is still too high to activate the alarm. The liner moves strictly according to the planned trajectory. The speed is stable. Thrust is at a minimum. The wind is light. All the parameters look like it's just a routine planned maneuver. 10 hours, 40 minutes, and 10 seconds. The height is just over 2,000 meters. On the recording, another knock on the door and the muffled voice of the commander can be heard. But the CVR microphone does not distinguish the words. They are too far from the panel. You can only hear the rhythm, which repeats over and over again. 10 hours, 40 minutes, and 25 seconds. It becomes visible on the dispatcher's radar. The trajectory crosses the mountain slope at an angle incompatible with moving to a new level. A red zone appears, an automatic warning that the safe altitude under the aircraft is rapidly decreasing. The dispatchers continue to call the board, but only the silence of the air remains. 10 hours, 40 minutes, and 50 seconds. GPWS gives the first signal. A short electronic tone is heard on the recording, an automatic warning that the terrain is rising too fast under the plane. But the response to the signal is zero. Autopilot modes remain unchanged. The control knobs are stationary. 10 hours, 40 minutes, and 55 seconds. Another sound appears on the recording, amplified knocks on the door, now with a metallic echo. This means that the commander is trying to use emergency means to open the door. But the construction, installed after 2001, is not amenable. 10 hours and 41 minutes. The GPWS system moves into the next phase and starts issuing warnings more frequently. A series of short signals that pilots hear on simulators as a command to climb immediately. But there is no reaction. 10 hours, 41 minutes, and 10 seconds. The last electronic warning can be heard through the steady noise of the onboard systems. It is pronounced in a synthetic voice, warning of the dangerous proximity of the surface. On the recording, the sound stops, but there remains a feeling of moving silence, as if the space around has shrunk to a single moment. 10 hours, 41 minutes, and 20 seconds. Outside is the white slope of the Alps, a light haze, the still mountain air. The aircraft moves straight without deviations, maintaining the course set by the system. 10 hours, 41 minutes, and 30 seconds. The last quiet crackle on the recording. The last GPWS signal. The last frame of the radar tag that the dispatchers see. And it all ended at 10:41. The Astrop mountain range is one of those corners of the Alps where time seems to stand still. Narrow slopes, sharp ridges, dense forests below and emptiness above. There are no roads, no routes for tourists, only silence, which persists even on windy days. It was this silence that became the first witness to what happened at 10:41 a.m. When the radar tag disappeared, the dispatchers realized that contact was lost. But in aviation, lost contact is not a verdict, but a procedure. Checks, frequency clarifications, and attempts to contact through neighboring sectors begin. But every second without an answer was getting harder. The airliner should not have disappeared from the surveillance system. Not in perfect weather, not at this altitude, not here among the European air corridors saturated with radars. In a matter of minutes, the French dispatchers transmitted the coordinates of the last known point to the emergency services. In the mountains, this information is almost never accurate. Aerial data shows the position in space, but does not reflect the terrain. However, the rescuers understood that the plane was already below the possible limits of radar control. The gendarmerie helicopter was the first to take off. His crew knew the area: difficult terrain, sharp climbs, strong updrafts. Flying there is always a risk, especially if you don't know what awaits you among the rocks. But the team went on the route, guided by the last point of the radar. As the helicopter reached the crash site, new information was received. A sound similar to a powerful impact was heard in nearby villages. Not an explosion, but a blow, as if a huge mass of metal had collided with a rock. But no one saw. In this part of the mountains, the peaks hide each other, and the sound is reflected in such a way that it is difficult to determine the direction. When the helicopter reached the spot, it took the crew a few seconds to realize the scale of what was happening. Against the background of the gray-white slope, many bright dots could be seen, fragments of the structure. Not a solid body, not a tail section, not a wing. The plane crashed into the slope at an angle at which there were no large structural elements. The mountain looked like it had been hit by a giant storm. Patches of scorched earth, scattered pieces of metal, and debris stretching down a narrow valley. The silence that usually fills the Alps felt completely different now. It was not the calm, natural silence, but the absence of any signs of life. The rescuers understood that the area was completely inaccessible to ground vehicles. You can only get there by air or on foot along the rocky trails. But the weather was getting worse. The wind was getting stronger, snow showers were rising from the peaks. Despite the conditions, the groups began to disembark. People descended on winches, clinging to the ledges of the rocks, holding on to the icy edges to get to the place. The first minutes of work on site only confirmed the worst fears. It was impossible to compare the picture with any ordinary emergency landing. The terrain has done its job. A sharp angle, a hard slope, and no platforms. The car, flying at high speed, left no room for survival. Rescuers did not see the fire. There was little fuel. The routes in the mountains would not have caused a strong fire. But the destruction of the structure was total. Even experienced gendarmerie officers who have worked on dozens of similar operations will later say, "We immediately realized that there was no one left to help, and yet the operation continued." In such situations, no one stops working, even when it is clear that there is no hope. Every element, fragment, and detail found creates a picture of the incident. But here the picture was so heavy that many rescuers simply fell silent for a moment, standing among the rocks. After a few hours, it became clear that not a single person on board could be found alive. The information is being officially received, and with her, the first shock. The news is spreading across Europe. A crisis center is being opened in Germany. In Dusseldorf, where the flight was supposed to arrive, passengers and greeters are taken to a separate lounge. People still don't understand what exactly happened. But they know one thing: the flight did not arrive. The first journalists appear on the perimeter of the airport. On the scoreboard opposite flight for U9525, the status that no one wanted to see lights up, delayed. And then he was lost. This change of emotions, from trying to summon the plane to understanding what had happened, became a moment of absolute impotence for everyone. The system, built on precision, standards, and millions of flight hours, for the first time in a long time faced a situation where technology did not fail, but nothing could stop the tragedy. Rescuers continued to work. The snow slowly covered the tracks, leaving only details that would later help reconstruct the last minutes of the flight. But there were no answers to the main question at that moment. But everyone needed answers: relatives, the world, and aviation. When the crash site was localized and rescuers confirmed the absence of survivors, the work shifted to those who had to understand the cause. In Europe, such specialists are known by the abbreviation BA, the Bureau of Investigation and Analysis of the Safety of French Civil Aviation. It is one of the most rigorous and technically equipped organizations in the world. Their task is not to find the culprits, but to restore the truth in the smallest traces. The first groups of experts arrived in the mountainous area before dawn the next day. The situation was complicated by the terrain: narrow ridges, rock falls, lack of platforms. Just to get to some areas, they had to move along ropes using climbing bindings. But for BA, this was a common occurrence. Aviation investigations often begin in the most difficult places. The main target was the black boxes. There are two of them: CVR, Speech Information Recorder; FDR, Flight Parameter Recorder. Both devices are designed to withstand extreme loads: pressure, temperature, shock. But even so, finding them among the rocks is almost a detective task. CVR was the first to be discovered. Its hull was damaged, but the protective capsule survived. For experts, this was a key element. Voice recording allows you to hear everything that was happening in the cockpit, from pilot conversations to the sounds of switches and warnings. A day later, the registrar was already taken to a laboratory near Paris, where decryption began. When the BA specialists turned on the audio channel, the first minutes confirmed a normal flight. A calm dialogue, working teams, and an exchange of phrases about the route. Then the sound of the cabin door closing. And after that, a long, continuous silence. But the most important thing is not the silence, but what preceded and followed it. The sound of the switches changing position. A click that sets a new height on the FCU panel. A slight mechanical noise characteristic of putting the autopilot into free descent mode. Then there are knocks on the door. The call of the access system. The increasing blows, already clearly audible on the recording. All of this was recorded with precise timing, allowing events to be reconstructed second by second. But the CVR is only half the picture. At the same time, the specialists analyzed the FDR recorder of hundreds of parameters: altitude, speed, engine mode, control position, autopilot configuration. This file is a mathematical model of the last flight. The reconstruction looked almost perfect technically. Not a single engine shut down. Not a single sensor is out of order. The electrical systems worked stably. The autopilot correctly executed the commands it received. There were no signs of depressurization or structural failure until impact with the ground. All the graph lines, temperature, pressure, angles of attack, turbine speeds were normal. There was not a single fault or failure alarm record that would indicate a technical cause. This meant one thing: the equipment worked as it was designed. All systems are working properly. No sudden rejection. There is no external factor. When these two parts, the audio recording and the technical data, were combined, the first serious hypothesis emerged. And she wasn't touching the plane. It was clearly audible on the recording. The door was closed. After that, only one person remained in the cabin. This was followed by the introduction of a minimum height. Then, activation of the reduction mode. And all this without a single word on the air. BA experts were slow to draw conclusions. They are obliged to exclude every alternative version. Pressure sensor failure, false readings of the threat systems, temporary loss of consciousness of the crew, hacking the access system, the impact of external factors, violation of automation. Each option was checked technically and documented. But the FDR data was unequivocal. The commands were entered manually. The BA laboratory tested a similar cabin on the Airbus A320. The experts reproduced all the clicks and sounds, comparing them with the CVR recording. The results matched. Everything that happened in the cockpit corresponded to the normal operation of the controls in the pilot's hands, not a system or an error. The investigators have only one question left, which now stands at the center of the whole tragedy. The autopilot commands were entered manually. The door was locked from the inside after the captain's exit. There was no radio exchange. All technical systems were working normally. The version about the co-pilot's intervention was not an assumption, but a fact that was confirmed instrumentally. But why? When the technical part of the investigation made it clear that the plane was following the commands of the person in the cockpit, the focus shifted to the one who remained inside at the time of descent. The co-pilot is Andreas Lubitza. But the task of the experts was not to create a sensation, but to understand how the system, built on dozens of control levels, missed a condition incompatible with safe operation. In aviation, the medical examination of a pilot is the foundation. The pilot doesn't just confirm his health, he confirms his ability to think soberly, make decisions, and act under pressure. He is evaluated by certified doctors every year. But in the case of Lubitz, a chain of events was revealed, which showed that even a strict system can fail if a person actively hides information. The investigators began working with medical documents, hospital archives, and doctors' statements. It turned out that a few years before the tragedy, Lubitza had already had episodes that required serious monitoring. He was undergoing treatment for psychological disorders related to anxiety. This information was known in some medical institutions, but was not shared with the airline. The reason is confidentiality and rules of medical secrecy. At the end of 2014, the co-pilot's condition worsened. There were symptoms that went beyond the usual anxiety. Doctors prescribed examinations and adjusted therapy. Some experts believed that he needed a break from work, while others believed that his condition was under control. But all this information was in separate medical structures that were not interconnected. The control system did not have a common center that could assemble the whole puzzle. The most critical period came about 2 months before GermanWings Flight 9525. Then a wording appeared in the documents of one of the specialists, which in aviation standards means only one thing: the pilot cannot fly. The doctor issued a temporary disability certificate. According to the rules, the pilot must notify the airline himself and not go on shift. But Lubitz didn't do it. The investigation revealed that he chose the opposite path. He hid the fact of medical visits, threw out official reports, and took medications without informing his employer. And here the most dangerous vulnerability of the system was revealed. Aviation medicine relies on the honesty of the pilot. If a person deliberately hides information, the system does not receive a signal. BA experts emphasized that the dispatchers could not prevent the tragedy. The equipment did not fail. The plane was fully operational. The regulations have been complied with, but there was a man inside the cabin who wasn't supposed to be on the line. And access to this information was not provided to anyone except himself and the doctors, bound by secrecy. The doctors who observed him in February-March 2015 gave different assessments of his condition. Some spoke of severe emotional fluctuations. Others noted the risk of developing psychotic manifestations, episodic disorders of perception and thinking. But none of them had the authority to contact the airline directly. The law protecting personal information has become a barrier. Against this background, the investigation revealed another important detail. A few days before the flight, Lubitz searched the internet for information about the cabin doors of the Airbus A320 and how to lock them. This data was not known until the decryption of the computer found at his home. There were questions not only from experts but also from society. Why did a person in a condition incompatible with the pilot's workload continue to fly? Why didn't the medical system have a mechanism for transmitting information about risks? Why have the strict standards of aviation proved powerless over the human decision to hide the disease? The answers were hard, because medicine and aviation exist in different legal spaces. One must keep the patient's secret. The second is obliged to ensure the safety of society. And between them, in this thin zone, there was a void that no one noticed in time. The technical part of the investigation proved that the plane was working perfectly. The autopilot followed the commands. The engines are stable. The systems are working properly. But there was a man in the cockpit whose condition did not correspond to the responsibility he bore. And that's the main thing. The equipment worked perfectly, but the control system is not. The GermanWings tragedy instantly brought the aviation industry into a state where every structure, from airlines to international regulators, had to review its own procedures. Not because of a technical glitch, not because of the weather conditions, and because the system, designed for millions of hours of safe flights, for the first time gave way where no one expected it, in the human factor. The first conclusions of the BA and the data of the medical examination became the basis for emergency decisions. The European Aviation Safety Agency, ASA, has issued interim directives that have changed the basic safety philosophy in the cockpit. The main one is the rule of 2 people permanently present in the cockpit if one of the pilots temporarily leaves it. Now, when the commander leaves, the flight attendant takes his place. This is not a pilot, not a person capable of controlling an airplane, but it is an additional pair of eyes, ears, and hands, a minimum of human presence that creates a connection with the outside world. The door should no longer remain closed between one person and the rest of the crew. This rule was introduced almost all over Europe and in dozens of airlines around the world in just a matter of weeks. It became a kind of psychological barrier that was supposed to prevent a repeat of the situation when the cabin turns into a completely isolated space beyond the control of anyone. At the same time, aviation medical centers began reviewing the assessment systems for the psycho-emotional state of pilots. Prior to that, the emphasis was on physical health, cognitive functions, and stress tolerance. Psychological interviews, regular assessments of the emotional background, and tests to identify hidden anxiety symptoms have now become a separate area. But the key was something else, the discussion of the medical data transfer system. It was not about violating medical secrecy, but about creating a mechanism in which critical information about the pilot's condition can be transmitted to the airline or the regulator if it threatens flight safety. This is a difficult question. Where is the boundary between the right to privacy and the duty to ensure the safety of hundreds of people? The experts tried to find a balance. Some countries have introduced a policy of controlled notification. If a doctor detects a condition that is potentially dangerous for flight operations, he receives the right or duty to inform aviation authorities. This decision does not eliminate the protection of personal data, but creates an exception for critical cases. The requirements for airlines have also changed. Now they are required to organize pilot support systems, access to psychologists and doctors directly, and not just through annual checks. Assistance programs have been created where the pilot can apply anonymously, without fear of losing his qualifications if the problem is identified at an early stage. Another important change is a deeper audit of training centers and medical institutions working with pilots. We check everything, from the correctness of documentation to how the process of monitoring the mental state of pilots is structured. But despite all these measures, one question has always remained at the center of the discussion: how to prevent a situation where a person with a deteriorating condition deliberately hides the symptoms. This has become a central topic for the expert groups of EASA, ICAO, and aviation associations. And despite dozens of decisions, the main realization was cruel. No system can predict a person's inner decision with absolute accuracy if he skillfully hides his condition. Aviation services have changed the trajectory of their approach to safety. Prior to GermanWings 9525, the emphasis was on technique and team mistakes that could be prevented by standards. After that, attention shifted to psychological reliability and early warning mechanisms. The aviation world has become a little more cautious and a little more distrustful. And this distrust was justified. No one wanted a repeat of the scenario in which an ideal technique becomes a tool in the hands of a person who should not have been in the cockpit. But the most paradoxical thing is that solutions created for protection sometimes create new threats. Sometimes tragedies are not born out of chaos, but out of too perfect an order. From systems that are built so reliably that they seem impenetrable. Of the solutions that save millions, but in a single case turn into a barrier stronger than any human effort. On that day, the Airbus approached the Alps like a wall. Cold, motionless, indifferent. These mountains have seen centuries of armies, caravans, storms, avalanches, flights and falls. For them, a person is just a moment, and the huge machine created by civilization is just a metallic shadow flying over the ancient peaks. And everything below, the ridge lines, slopes, glaciers, reflected itself in the cabin, where the silence was so dense, as if nature itself was listening to the last seconds. The technique worked perfectly. The autopilot was on course. The electronics were not wrong. Everything that civilization could provide worked as it should. But behind that door, the one that was armored, reinforced, and had passed thousands of tests after September 11th, was a man to whom the system no longer had access. The door, created to protect the cabin from an external threat, became a barrier against those who tried to save the plane from the inside that day. And in this contrast lies the whole philosophy of this story. Technology can stop an external enemy, but it cannot always penetrate the human psyche. The system can protect an airplane, but it cannot force a person to admit to their own condition. She can withstand pressure, temperature, shocks, but she can't withstand one person's decision to keep a secret. The mountains stood in absolute silence, watching as fate flew towards them. The cabin, isolated and reinforced, remained the only place on the planet where something happened that determined the further path of the entire flight. The outside world was calling. Knocks on the door, dispatcher calls, attempts by other pilots to get in touch. The world was talking, but there were no answers. And all this time, the plane continued to obey commands as well as it had done thousands of times before. He didn't know the tragedy. He didn't know how to tell the right commands from the wrong ones. He was just following instructions. And this is the gravity and paradox of aviation. An airplane is an ideal tool, but it is unable to resist if the person inside has ceased to be part of the system. When it was all over, there wasn't just debris left on the ground. There is still a question that cannot be measured in numbers, regulations, or technical reports. How to prevent something that does not affect the sensors? How can you predict what's hidden behind a smile, documents, or formal security clearances? And how can we ensure safety where the problem is not in the wings, not in the engines, not in the autopilot, but in the depths of human consciousness? This tragedy has become a lesson. Quiet, hard, painful. She changed the rules, protocols, and approaches to medical assessment. She made aviation more attentive, more cautious, more suspicious. She forced me to admit that even an ideal system is sometimes powerless before the internal decisions of one person. The Alps were as calm as ever. Their tops knew nothing about fears, rules, protocols, or human weaknesses. They were witnesses but not participants. And in this silence there is the main idea of the whole story. Safety is not just about technology. This is a delicate balance between the system and a person, where a failure in one link can negate everything else. And when the plane disappeared into the alpine slopes, not only facts and figures remained. There was a silence in which everyone who studied this story asked themselves the same question. How can we make sure that no one who finds themselves on the other side of an armored door becomes a point of no return? And this silence is the hardest.